Right. All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Uh, my name is MK Sadiq. I am the Research and Evaluation Manager at the Regional Arts Commission. I am wearing, for those of you who might have such inquiries, I'm wearing my big blocky black glasses, and I'm wearing a bucket hat that's black and white and a kind of a pea green shirt, and I have like a goatee. And today we're going to go over this question of arts disciplines or arts industries. Um, I'm going to go through it pretty quickly. If you have questions along the way, certainly put them in the chat, and I'll make the PowerPoint available to you probably, well, we'll make it available to you soon. The most important thing to think about is the questions that you might have, because actually they're generative. So whatever question that you may have, I might be able to answer in a subsequent presentation or even in writing, as we will provide a write-up for today as well. So we'll begin. So I'm kind of starting with these two theses. First, the profit motive commercializes art and artistic practice. And it's interesting to think about because, one, whether or not an artist has a profit motive, the profit motive itself is bigger than the intention of the artist. Some entities will profit off the artist, even if the artist is not a willing participant. And through the lens of economic impact, the arts discipline is an industry. So I just wanted to get that big idea out the way first, that once we begin to look at artistic practice through the lens of economic impact, it undoubtedly becomes industry or a way of seeing business, right? And so the next part I want to get us oriented to is this notion that the arts or the creative sector of St. Louis is largely populated by gig workers. Now, some of you may already know it. Yes, there are arts administrators, but I would suggest that from low overall wages, this is simply gig work and not living wage work. Too, they are support personnel, meaning these arts administrators in the St. Louis art world, not always the artist. Now I'll talk a little bit about what that means in just a moment. And then three, the artist appears to be mainly a gig worker within this construct. Again, I'll get into it in just a bit. It's a lot, but we'll get there. First, let's deal with Howard Becker's art worlds. So Howard Becker, back in the early 1980s, wrote this book called Art Worlds. And in it, it gives us a real understanding of how the artist as well as the artwork is created. It's normally done in collaboration with a bunch of people, or even not in collaboration. Sometimes it's just simply supply chain factors, such as someone making or stretching canvas or making paint, a person who will never know the artist personally or individually, but instead is just providing something for the market. And in this case, we have the artist who would benefit, like the painter, who might benefit from the fabrication of these things or the manufacture of these things without ever knowing it. And yet, that person that manufactured it is a part of this art world, is a part of this larger experience. And then, two, eh, because we are the Regional Arts Commission of St. Louis, we work with a lot of nonprofits that are arts organizations as well as culture organizations. And even in that scenario, the artist who is working with, collaborating with the arts organization or as a part of the arts organization in a meaningful way, or even not so meaningful, well, those arts administrators are part of the personnel that supports artistic creation, right? Artistic practice. These are important things to kind of keep in mind, because when we go down the road and we begin to look at the different sort of occupations that are involved, you might say, well, these people aren't necessarily artists, but they're all a part of the milieu. They're all a part of what makes the art happen in the first place. People who might provide insight, might provide feedback, might provide anything, honestly. So these are all people who are part of the conversation. So don't forget that. Some blurred lines when we think about entrepreneurs and workers, right? First and foremost, in 2022, the U.S. Census revealed the receipts of individual proprietorships in selected industries and independent artist receipts came in around just second to the taxi and limousine service industry, and just ahead of the janitorial services at about $24.5 billion. Now, these numbers, which you can also see on the census website, again, they're the way to look at them is that you see the number and you times that by 1,000, and that gives you the true number of, or the true size of that particular output. In this particular case, what does that receipt look like for St. Louis? It looks like $91.6 million in terms of receipts. Now, what I mean or what they mean are all the individuals who are either sole proprietors, they may actually have a business that they've incorporated, or not. You know, again, they just simply might be a contractor and they don't necessarily have to have an incorporated business to be counted as an establishment. In this particular case, they looked at all the relevant, let's say, tax returns, actually not even let's say, just it is tax returns. And they were able to calculate by coding the data, those tax return data, so that we have a sense of the size of things. And one of the things they've been monitoring with this, what's called non-employer data, or these non-employer statistics, it's just the size, the growing size of the gig economy. And you see where arts falls in this conversation. It is certainly robust, but alarmingly for some, perhaps, it is a gig economy. So, or it's gig work. So let me just kind of say this bigger thing, right? So when it comes to data and methodology, you don't really want to mix apples and oranges. So if I take one study from, let's say, the Regional Arts Commission, and then I take U.S. Census data, you don't necessarily want to put them together and say that, okay, all together, this is what it means. It's because of how we collect the data. We're collecting the data in very different ways. And because we're collecting the data in very different ways, really we can't really say that the data might fit together. That's where the research design and the methodology comes in. But for our purposes, and really as a thought experiment, I do want to put these two data in conversation. So back in 2023, as you all know, the Regional Arts Commission, in partnership with Americans for the Arts, reported that $868.7 million in economic activity spending for St. Louis City and St. Louis County organizations and happened. And this occurred in 2022. This is in reference to 2022 data. But when it happened, this lets us know the size of the economic activity of the arts. You know, all this wonderful stuff that artists and arts organizations are doing, this is what it led to, right? That's a big number, nearly $1 billion. It gets close to $1 billion. But for methodological reasons, again, we don't necessarily want to use what's called the non-employer statistic with the AEP6 number, but it's so tempting. So if we look at the direct spending that comes out of AEP6, so there's two buckets that they look at. They look at audience behavior and they look at organization behavior. And so the organization behavior in terms of its direct spending, and this would be maybe on salaries, on materials for exhibition space, preparation for walls, all those kinds of things that might be a part of it. Well, that number came to about $579,333,295. And it breaks down to a possible salary of $42,607. And that's in take-home pay. And that's already taking out the taxes. So one of the things that, you know, first of all, they're really good over at AFTA, Americans for the Arts. And they were able to kind of let us know as an organization how we might be able to understand the data, like the big number, right? And the big number here that I'm focusing on is strictly from direct spending from organizations, as opposed to audience information, because that's not necessarily directly going to the worker or the arts I mean, it is and it isn't going to the arts organization. Sometimes it just goes to, let's say, the eatery right down the street from a venue or from an event. So that take-home pay that we focus on, that $42,000, well, technically, that is above what a person would need to live in St. Louis with a living wage. But the NES data that we have from that same period, as you can see here, is 91.6 million, $91,694,000, right? And in that same number, the NES was able to identify about 4,752 artists. So that roughly breaks down to about $19,295. Actually, not even roughly, that's about what it is. Now, that said, that 19,000 looks a whole lot different from the 42,000. As a matter of fact, if you go to the MIT Living Wage Calculator, what you see is that for the St. Louis area, this is for the greater St. Louis area, if you will, that number is about $37,889. So that's if you don't have any children, living on your own. And so if that number is 37,000 and you're actually doing that 42,000, and that would be that line that you might have seen from AFTA and us from the Regional Arts Commission saying that this economic output or this economic activity supports X amount of jobs. Well, you put that into the formula, we get to about 42,000, and again, living wage. However, if the reality for some is not necessarily 42,000 from this great output from our economic activity as a region, if it's closer to that 19,000, which it might be for a lot, and this is before taxes, we know that that's not a living wage. Therefore, we might just land on the idea that that is gig money. I mean, that's not enough money to really be able to take care of all your responsibilities if that's what you were paid on an annual basis, especially given the fact that taxes still might be taken out. Now, as we think about it in terms of like taxes, for a lot of nonprofit organizations, one of the things that nonprofits have to file is called the 990. It's our tax return. And there are three types of tax returns. There is the 990N, which is the postcard, essentially saying that, hey, we exist as an organization, we do these great things, but we spend or make less than about $50,000 a year. Then there's the 990EZ, which goes up like a tier to roughly about $250,000, but never beyond. And then there's the 990, the full 990. So if you make millions of dollars, spend millions of dollars as an organization, well, the 990 is the one that you want to complete. So continuing with this 2022 number, because again, that's where our AEP6 data is referencing. As well as some of the other data that I just mentioned. As much as 63.2 million was spent on freelance workers. Now, that's doing a data scrub of about 664 tax returns of tax exempt entities. Yes, I did a data scrub of all these different organizations. And it's completely, there and available because the point of the 990 is to give people who are interested, who are curious, who are researchers, a sense of how money might be spent, perhaps for public accountability or just out of curiosity. But bottom line to it, this is just how we look at it. Now, we note that 63.2 million may not have gone only to artists. So again, for all these 600 so organizations that are in the St. Louis region, specifically St. Louis City, St. Louis County, that's a lot, again, a lot of arts and culture orgs. Not all of them may have paid artists directly. Instead, could have gone to staff, could have gone to non-artists who were helping to support the charitable mission of that organization. So this is perhaps an understated number due to the availability of financial records of nonprofit arts orgs. And I want to make a quick point here before I continue. It's so important that when the Regional Arts Commission or any sort of data gathering body is asking organizations to participate in this process, that we get data because we don't have a full picture of what the economy looks like without it. And so in this case, we are missing a lot of data because about 60% of the organizations that are operating, that are doing their charitable nonprofit arts and culture work in the city, in the county of St. Louis, file a 990N, meaning that they don't have to report any data at all. They just simply say that they exist and that they spent less than $50,000. And again, that's fine, but we're missing information. Like we don't have a full sense of things. That said, this 63.2 is again likely understated because we don't know the full economic activity of these organizations. Now, no available data on numbers of arts workers except through the non-employer statistic. And again, we go back to the $19,000 that we just talked about a moment ago, because again, that's the only way that we can kind of get a sense of where we were with workers. Again, about 4,000 people, about $19,000 if you were to calculate what the average wage would be for a year for those 4,000 or some odd workers, art workers, I should say. So notes on the non-employer data. So last year, you might have heard SMU Data Arts, and certainly we reported this on our websites. Last year, SMU Data Arts used it as one of 13 factors to determine arts vibrancy for St. Louis. This led to St. Louis being ranked 20 of 20 in the 2023 For Large Communities observation, I'll say, right, report the SMU Data Arts put out there. So that means that they were tracking and looking at this number that comes from the census, and we'll talk a little bit more about it in just a bit, to kind of get a sense of where St. Louis fell. Now, per the U.S. Census, a non-employer business is one that has no paid employees, has annual business receipts of $1,000 or more, and is subject to federal income taxes. So what does that mean? We're talking about artists, in this case, who are sole proprietors. They are considered establishments, like in the data itself. They use the word establishment, but what they're really talking about are humans who are doing this work that's in the arts and culture sector. But according to the IRS and to the U.S. Census, they're using the word establishment to kind of perhaps inartfully describe an economic activity. So industries based on the North American Industry Classification System, or the NAICS. So that classification system is what we're using to kind of track this sort of arts and economic activity for the St. Louis area. So for data arts, they chose the metropolitan statistical area, which includes about 13 counties outside of St. Louis City and St. Louis County. And of course, we know that St. Louis City kind of is like its own county, due to the great divorce that happened in the late 1800s. So St. Louis County has its own county, and St. Louis City effectively has a county level to it. And so if you add to that the 13 other counties that are surrounding us in the Metro East as well as west of St. Louis, then that gets us to that. And that is the unit that SMU Data Arts used to help us get at their number. Unfortunately, it doesn't quite capture with specificity what St. Louis City and St. Louis County does. And if we really want to know, well, let's say with St. Charles or other counties that are nearby that are just adjacent, we can look at that. So we'll just say that for people who aren't necessarily on the ground, they might turn to that when it may not accurately reflect what St. Louis City and St. Louis County looks like. So for us, because we know and because our legislation that creates the Regional Arts Commission is bounded by this idea of St. Louis City and St. Louis County, we'll focus mainly on that. So at the industry level, it looks like 7111, that's performing arts companies. And again, don't get it twisted. 7111 performing arts companies, we're not actually talking about companies. We're still talking about non-employer data. So in other words, individuals who don't have employees to pay, but they are in effect contractors working within different systems, right? With different organizations or doing different things, maybe with departments in St. Louis County, St. Louis City, whatever the case may be, but they're ultimately independent and they do contract work. 7115 accounts for independent artists, writers, and performers. Again, more of the same. So let's get to some data. And then after this, if you have any questions, I will be happy to answer them or respond via email or however you like. St. Louis trends, number of artists. Artists who file tax returns. Again, this is what that non-employer data is artists who file tax returns. In 2018, it was 4,800. Then it goes up to about 4,900, nearly 5,000 artists who file tax returns in St. Louis City, St. Louis County. And then it drops down, as we might expect during the pandemic, to 4,200. And then 4,800 as we get to 2021, 5,200 when we get to 2022, and then 5,200 yet again, but a little bit higher with 5,275 in 2023. So let's put it a couple different ways. One, we started in this like over the 6 year span with a lower number of artists who filed tax returns. By the time we get to 2023, a larger number. Is it because people have bounced back from the pandemic? Well, we see that the number was smaller even before the pandemic reared its ugly head. Instead, we might see that maybe more artists are able to participate in the economy and file taxes. Somehow, there are more jobs or gigs that the St. Louis region is able to support with these artists in 2023 versus 2018. So that's one particular way to look at it. How much artists earn, receipts on artist revenue. So this is how much in aggregate, like all together, these artists were able to claim that they've earned. And we see that number again goes from 75 million all the way up to 103 million by the time that we get to 2023. What, of course, the pandemic dip in 2020. So we see that artists are, in the aggregate sense, able to generate a lot of money. It sounds like it's a lot, but in reality, it's not a lot. In fact, this is what it would look like if we were to just do the math and just figure out the average annual payroll, as it might be called. So in 2018, that number looked like 15,000. Then it goes all the way up to 19,000. And again, that's the reason why we say that these are like gig numbers. I mean, this isn't information or amounts of money that you can use to really support yourself with a living wage in St. Louis. So let's tease this out a little bit. St. Louis City, St. Louis County. I'm going to kind of speed up a little bit. St. Louis City and St. Louis County file taxes. For the city in purple, we see that there's a lower number that file taxes in each of those years. It doesn't mean that there are fewer artists in the city of St. Louis. It just means that fewer of them actually file taxes on their economic activity as artists. St. Louis County, we see a higher number. There's another number that I would certainly share, but it kind of creates, I don't know, best way to put it would be that it doesn't quite get at the truth, which is this big aggregate number, as we saw a moment ago, versus the smaller numbers. Well, there's no need to go there, but we can look at the actual average annual wages for St. Louis City and St. Louis County. Let's call them art workers or art entrepreneurs. Gig workers for sure. Gig workers in the arts. Bottom line to it, we see that there is quite a bit of separation in the 2018 data. This is all coming from, again, the non-employer statistic available from the census. And then we get to 2019 and we see that number is closer. It's partly because revenues have gone down for St. Louis County tax filers, and then revenues went up for St. Louis City tax filers. We begin to see that separation again in 2020, even though there was still a bit of a dip for both. And then as we start to recover, we still see that separation between St. Louis County and St. Louis City, and that continues on through 2023. As a matter of fact, it looks like it's beginning to widen again, back to maybe a 2018 level of separation. Now, why is that? I don't have a reason. But if you have any ideas, feel free to share them with us because I'm all about hypotheses, things that we could test. The Bureau of Labor Statistics and the State Workforce Agency gives us a different type of data that we might see with the Bureau of Labor Statistics. That's called the Occupational and Employment Wage Statistics. So that data is available for the St. Louis region. So again, that would be that larger 15 county region. We'll use this data to learn the number of employed creatives as surveyed by employers, number of employees. So these are people like a survey happened. They called somebody who employs artists or of some kind or creatives of some kind, and then these employers answer the call and provide survey data. So these are individuals who are surveyed by this by basically the Bureau of Labor Statistics / whatever the workforce state agency might be for a given state. And we see that the numbers have reportedly gone down. It went up a little bit in 2021 and then goes back down. We also see average hourly wages go up, which is interesting, and it makes sense because as we start to recover and some people decide not to move towards going back into the workforce or that particular area of the workforce, and the money is still there, or perhaps overinvestment in workers or proper investment in workers might lead to higher wages. These things are completely possible and reasonable. But what's more important is to see that these are the number of employed artists. So top 5 occupations by average hourly wage, art directors, $49.45. Musicians and singers, $45.22. Fashion designers, $43.39. Commercial and industrial designers at $43.02. Media and communication equipment workers at $41.08. Again, creative work, right? Creative work. What are the bottom 5? Yeah. Floral designers. Now, this is kind of like reverse order, if you will. So starting with the smallest wage earner, or the lowest wage earner, we see the floral designers, $16.44. Merchandise displayers and window trimmers, again, creative work, $19.17. Fine artists, including painters, sculptors, and illustrators, $22.06. Photographers, $22.73. And I know so many photographers. Set and exhibit designers, $5.71. So, and it just kind of goes up from there. Now, there are some occupations that were never presented in the occupational and employment wage statistic, and it's partly because that data is unstable. Like they don't get enough information, and some of those people who are included are craft artists, dancers, broadcast, radio, DJs. But when we did see dancers, dancers were somewhere around $17 per hour. Again, these are wages that don't necessarily add up to living wage for the area. And the last little bit, more on this RAC applicant data that I might have mentioned before. One is that RAC collects data, or at least it used to collect a lot of data. And back in 2018, it collected data from about 116 arts organizations with expenditures that range from about $6,000 to $30 million. Yet with such range, only 6 organizations reporting paying $0 to local artists. And that was another thing that RAC used to track, was how much money was paid to local artists. The remaining 110 organizations paid about 7,288 artists, $19.5 million. So the average local artist compensation range from the gig honorarium level of $23, not per hour, just $23 forever for a performance, or $54,000 for a year or annually. So we see a range, and honestly, that is like the experience for artists in St. Louis. You'll get an honorarium. It might be super low. And then there are some people who are actually able to make a living, from their art and have a reliable income stream from it. And this is how it teases out using a pie chart, basically coding the organizations that were a part of that data gathering for the Regional Arts Commission, and we kind of see how things break down with a sizable amount of those dollars, the 19 million reported towards paying local artists. coming from classic music or classical music, and then we see the next biggest chunk coming from theater. And that's something that I've seen over and over again, and that you probably are somewhat familiar with in terms of the bigger generators of dollars in the region. That said, I think that is all that I have to share on that. If there are any questions, I'm happy to entertain them in maybe a couple of minutes while we are still here. Otherwise, feel free to just contact us at the Regional Arts Commission, send me an email, whatever the case may be. There's something that I said that wasn't quite correct and you want to offer a correction, I'm here for it. I'm humble. If there's something that you want to know more about, I'm happy to discuss it with you. So, Jay, I don't know if there are any questions because I certainly wasn't paying attention, but otherwise.
No questions so far.
Okay, perfect. Well, actually, guess what, guys? That's it for me. Like, I wanted to make this quick. I wanted to make this bite-sized, mainly so that when we put this online, people can review it, they can see it. You'll also see in short order a bit of a write-up plus this PowerPoint with references so that you can see where the data comes from, what it's all about, and then use that for your own understanding and for your own growth. All right. And hopefully this has been somewhat useful to you. You have a sense of about how many artists are operating in the St. Louis area, more so as working artists. One thing I do wanted to add is that back in 2018, the total number of artists that we were able to capture through our data collection for applicants was about 9,000, right? And which is, again, it's interesting because that's not necessarily connected to anything economic. These are just artists who are identified as such by the arts organization. We don't know if that's 9,000 unique artists or if these are artists who might belong to or associate with multiple organizations. They just happen to show up multiple times. Unfortunately, we weren't able to verify that information at the time, but that said, my hope is that as we continue to grow at the Regional Arts Commission, that we'll get back into some of those data gathering practices. And we hope that all of you participate because the more we're able to learn about our sector, the better off we all are. And then we can use that information to guide what we do organizationally or individually. With that said, I want to say thank you for joining us today. I want to say thank you to my partner in crime here, Jay Scherter, for being my wingman on the notes and in the questions. And I want to thank you for being a participant in this process. Have a good day.